was Operation Black Candles, never mentioned in your history class? It was more than just a mission. It was psychological warfare, sabotage, and survival. The files were hidden for decades. The truth about Black Candles is finally coming to light. Let's dive in. Operation Black Candle history. London, 1943. Deep under the MI6 headquarters, a new mission was started. Operation Black Candle. A Nazi biological weapon was being transported through occupied France. The British had only a few days to stop it. A team of 4 female agents from the Special Operations Executive was picked. They had no uniforms, no official records, just silence, skill, and willingness to sacrifice. Eleanor Hart was a former stage actress who spoke 6 languages. Her beauty and charm made her the perfect spy. Louise Mercier, a French demolitions expert, had lost her family to the Gestapo. Her anger was quiet but deadly. Ruth Patel, a radio engineer from Bombay, could build a transmitter from scrap wire and broken glass. Nora Blake, a sniper from Yorkshire, had the eyes of a hawk and the calm of a rock. Together, they were the final hope to prevent a disaster. They jumped from a plane into a forest near Cannes under a cloudy sky. Their local contact had been killed the day before. No map, no backup, just a name and a factory. A chemical plant guarded by the SSS. Inside nerve. Gas. Enough to kill thousands. They dressed as nuns and refugees and hid in the ruined streets. A kind baker gave them shelter in his attic. Ruth fixed up a radio from old parts. Nora watched the guards' routines. Eleanor got information from an officer who liked her. From secret messages, they learned a weapon was ready to move in 5 days. Louise planned how to destroy the plant. Ruth sent a message. Target confirmed. Need extraction. But London didn't answer. No reply came. They couldn't wait any longer. On the 3rd night, they sneaked through the sewers under the factory. Eleanor gave the guard outside a drug so he wouldn't wake up. Louise put bombs on the fuel tanks. Nora used a rifle with a scope from a tower nearby to keep things safe. But one of the guard dogs smelled them. Sirens started blaring. People started shooting. Ruth got caught. The others ran into the dark. Eleanor had to make a hard choice: run or go back for Ruth. She did both. The mission would go on, but not without her. In the underground cells of the camp, Ruth wouldn't say anything. She used a bent spoon to write the code for the explosion on the bottom of her shoe. Meanwhile, Eleanor and Louise went back to the attic to plan their next move. Nora never came back. No one knew where she had gone. Only 2 days were left. Louise wanted to attack the plan again, even if it meant dying. If we die loud, she said. Eleanor agreed. We do this for Ruth. That night, they made their final plan. Everything was quiet in Cannes. The second time in, things went easier until they got to the lab. Inside, big glass jars with green liquid were glowing under weak lights. Louise placed charges, but her hands were shaking. Suddenly, someone came walking. A guard. Eleanor shot him. That was her first kill. They ran just as the bombs started going off. The whole place burned down in flames. The smoke turned green. The gas had been let out, but only into the air. The wind took it away from the town, but the damage was done. Louise was hit by flying parts. They pulled her to safety behind a stoned wall. Blood stained her coat. She gave a weak smile. Light the candle, Ellie. Then she stopped breathing. Eleanor clenched her teeth. No time to cry. She and Ruth had to run. They reached the river port by dawn. A fisherman, who had been paid days before, waited with a little boat. He said nothing, just nodded. The engines started, taking them away from the smoke, the sirens, and the body of their lost sister. In London, there was no debrief. MI6 wiped the mission from records. Officially, it never happened. No medals, no names. But the weapon was gone. The war had changed, saved by ghosts in the dark. Eleanor never took another mission. Ruth went back to India and lived quietly. Nora was never found. Some say she joined fighters in Norway. But every March 14th, Eleanor lit a single black candle in her window. One day, a young girl asked, "Why do you light it, ma'am?" Eleanor smiled weakly. For someone brave. She never said more. The candle burned late into the night. Many years later, parts of the mission came to light: an old rifle found in Cannes, a boot with numbers carved into the sole, a photo of 4 women by a plane. But no records were left. Just whispers. Operation Black Candle was never written in history, but Europe remembered in silence. In the spaces between wars, sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that changed everything. You've heard about Auschwitz concentration camp, but have you heard this story? Behind every headline was a human story, and this is one of them. This is not just history. It is a story of survival, hope, and faith. The train screeched to a stop. Joseph Levine, a Jewish artist from Krakow, stepped into the thick, suffocating air of Auschwitz. His sketchbook had been torn from his coat when he arrived. In its place, a tattoo number 27 was burned into his arm. Names were gone. Only numbers were left. Joseph wasn't strong. He wasn't a worker or a talker. He kept his head down, hoping to disappear. But one day, a guard saw him drawing a face in the dirt with a twig. That drawing made a big difference. Instead of being shot, he was called. He was taken before an SS officer Hoopstam for Vogel, who looked at him in silence. "You can draw," Vogel said. "You'll paint for me now. Portraits. Realistic. No tricks. Understand?" Joseph nodded. That night he was taken from the cold barracks to a stone room with paper, paint, and quiet. His food got better. The beatings stopped, but he could still hear screams from the other rooms. Every week, he painted a new officer. They wanted their medals to look shiny and their eyes to look fierce. Joseph painted with care, but he started adding tiny mistakes so small they were almost invisible. A medal just a little off, an eye that seemed too empty. Then he painted their family. Wives, children, some officers smiled in the paintings, holding hands with the ones they'd seen on leave before, going back to being cruel. Joseph painted their love with the same hands that made their fear look real. One day, Vogel placed a single photo on the desk. A girl with braids, no older than 8. "My daughter," he said. "Make her perfect." Joseph looked at the picture. The girl looked like a child he'd seen crying near the fence. Was it the same one? He painted slowly, tenderly. In the corner, behind her, he added something the officer hadn't asked for. A small figure behind the glass, blurry, watching. A silent witness. It was Joseph himself hidden in plain sight. Weeks went by. He started painting more, hidden figures always in the background. A hand holding a fence, ash falling from the sky. No one noticed. Or so he thought. One day, a guard asked, "What's that shadow in the back?" Joseph shrugged. "Just texture. A mistake." The guard laughed. "You artists always making things up." The paintings were sent home, hung on walls. Horrible things, disguised as beauty. Joseph started hiding tiny drawings on scraps of paper messages tucked into the coats of prisoners sent to other camps. A flower, a mother, a prayer, quiet resistance in ink. Stories began to spread. Some prisoners said there was an artist who painted angels and ghosts into Nazi portraits. Others said he painted hope. Joseph said nothing. He just kept painting. Then one night, Vogel came storming in, holding a torn painting. "What is this?" he shouted, pointing to a small face in a mirror behind a woman. "Who is this meant to be?" Joseph stayed still. "No one. Just a reflection." Vogel hit Joseph in the face. He was dragged out, beaten, left for dead, but he survived. A fellow prisoner, a doctor, sewed him up in the dark with a bent needle and silence. Joseph was taken back to the studio, bruised but alive. No more portraits for a month. Just silence. Then, suddenly, Vogel returned with a canvas. "Paint me," he said, "but make me immortal." Joseph agreed. He painted the officer tall, strong, untouched by the war. But behind him, a faint shape appeared, a child curled up under a table, hidden from view. The officer didn't notice. In the winter of 1944, as the Soviets came closer, the Nazis burned papers. Art was destroyed too. But Joseph's studio had secret spaces. He kept what he could, hiding paintings under the floorboards. When the war ended, Joseph could barely walk. The Soviets found him in the corner of the studio, holding a painting he hadn't finished, an officer with fire in his eyes and ash falling around him. Joseph never went back to He moved to France, changed his name, and started a gallery. He stopped painting faces. Instead, he painted shadows, reflections, and the backs of people walking away. Years later, one of his hidden paintings was found in Berlin. A woman saw her mother in it and a strange figure in the background that looked exactly like Joseph. The world never really knew what Joseph went through, but in every painting he made, he told the truth. Not in the eyes of the powerful, but in the ghosts they never meant to see. The Auschwitz concentration camp claimed millions of lives and left a deep scar in human history, a tragedy that should never have happened. Be part of the journey. Subscribe now, and let's grow together. When Private Thomas Reed stepped onto the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy, he wasn't thinking of victory or medals, he was thinking of the 94 letters tucked against his chest, none of which had ever been sent. While others carried rifles and rations, Thomas carried words, written in case he never returned. The beaches of Normandy were soaked with blood and rain. June 6, 1944. Thousands of Allied soldiers landed on the shore, facing heavy German gunfire. Among them was a young American soldier named Thomas Reed. He jumped from a landing boat. Holding more than just weapons, he also carried letters that he had never sent. Thomas wasn't a sniper. He wasn't a hero. He was a writer. Before the war, he worked in a small bookstore in Ohio. When he was drafted, he brought a notebook and a pen, not faith. Every day since training, Thomas wrote a letter to the woman he loved, Eleanor, but he never sent any. He was afraid the letters would bring sadness instead of comfort. In Normandy, bullets came flying like a storm of metal. Thomas hid behind barbed wire, listening to every sound, every fear. He wrote, "Today I saw the sky falling in hot lead." His unit moved into a small village. There, they found children hiding in a church. Thomas helped a girl who had lost her parents. He wrote her name in his 73rd letter. One night, as his troops rested, Thomas read all his letters again. Each page held a piece of himself that was still whole. He whispered, "If I don't come home, let my words do." But war had no place for poetry. In the next battle, a friend was killed in his arms. Thomas held his hand and wrote his name in the margin of the 81st letter. "You will be remembered." The soldiers started to feel more despair. Thomas, without knowing it, grew close to their souls. He wrote their stories, treating them like prayers. "It's not just the bullets that keep us alive," he wrote, "but the names we leave behind." On the 47th day in Normandy, a big explosion shook the village. Thomas was hit by shrapnel and fell unconscious. He was taken to a medical tent, on the edge of death. On his chest, a pouch with 94 letters, none of which Eleanor had ever read. The doctor found the letters and handed them to the officers. Some soldiers read them in secret at night. They cried, laughed, and felt like they were alive again. The letters gave them a second life. Thomas survived, but he lost some hearing and had a leg injury. He could no longer fight. He was asked to go back to headquarters, but he refused. "I still have things to write," he said. He became an unofficial war storyteller. When soldiers died, he wrote about them. Not just numbers, but real people. He wrote to their mothers, sisters, and lovers. But still, he never sent a single letter to Eleanor. The war ended in Europe in 1945. Thomas went back home. In his hands were only two things, a cane and a box of letters. He stood in front of Eleanor's house, shaking. He knocked on the door and said, "I have something for you, but you must read it yourself." Eleanor read them one after another. He cried, laughed, and paused on his 100th letter. "If I can't be the man who returns from war, let me be the story that keeps you believing in love." They married 3 months later, but Thomas never wrote again. He said, "Everything is written in Normandy. We'll do the rest together." Years went by. Thomas became a teacher. In his classes, he taught not tactics or history, but the importance of a name, a word, a sacrifice. Every June 6th, he went to the beach. He picked up a handful of Normandy sand and put it in a small jar. He said, "This isn't just dirt. It's the last page of a book that was never finished." At the age of 82, Thomas died in his sleep. On his bedside table was a jar of sand, and one last unsent letter written with just one sentence, "Thank you for reading me." And on his grave, Eleanor buried that jar of sand. On his tombstone it is written, "Here lies the voice of 100 souls." He wrote, so they would not be forgotten. They never saw her face, but her voice was feared more than bullets. In Nazi-occupied Amsterdam, where speaking the truth could cost your life, a teenage girl turned a hidden attic and a stolen transmitter into the loudest weapon the resistance had. They called her the Swan, and her voice flew through the darkness, carrying secrets, warnings, and hope. Let's dive in shadows, behind the radio. The voice of Amsterdam's resistance. Amsterdam, 1943. The city seemed peaceful, but the quiet was actually filled with fear. People couldn't talk on the radio. Windows were covered so no lights could be seen. But in a small, tight attic above a bakery, someone broke the silence. It was Lee Van Rijn, a 17-year-old girl who had already become a target of the Nazi regime. Lee's father used to be a reporter before the Nazis took over. When he disappeared during a search, she found his secret radio transmitter hidden behind a bookcase. She learned how to use it, one broken signal at a time. Every night at midnight, when the city was asleep, she would speak into the radio. She shared messages in Dutch and secret warnings. A train from Utrecht is bringing weapons. Stay away from the checkpoint by the bridge. Her voice was steady and clear, and she never got caught. She went by the name Zuon, the Swan. No one knew what she looked like, but the resistance started to listen. Even Allied soldiers who crashed in the Netherlands trusted her for help to avoid being captured. Her broadcasts weren't just intelligence, they were hope. Lee read banned poems, announced names of missing Jews, and even described the color of the sky to remind people the world still existed beyond shadows. Every message was a risk. The Gestapo triangulated signals. Twice they came within blocks of her attic. She learned to move fast, change locations, carry nothing. Her world became wires, whispers, and coded scripts. Only 3 people knew her secret. Her younger brother Bram, who helped deliver messages, Mrs. Capel, the baker below, who hid their signal wires in flour sacks, and old Mr. DeWitt, who'd once repaired radios for the army. One night, a coded letter arrived from London. Zuon confirmed. Keep broadcasting. Operation Ember begins. Lee didn't know what Operation Ember was, but she knew she was now part of something much bigger. With guidance from London, she began transmitting Allied weather reports, vital for DI planning. She spoke carefully, hiding forecasts within lullabies and old Dutch proverbs. Her signal traveled farther than she ever dreamed, but the danger grew. One evening Bram didn't return from a courier run. Lee waited in silence, the radio off. When he came back at dawn, bloody and bruised, he whispered, "They're coming. They know about Zoan. They packed everything." The transmitter was dismantled, the notes burned. Mrs. Capel handed them fresh bread, tears in her eyes. "You gave us back our voice," she said. "Now run." They fled across canals, hiding in hay carts and abandoned homes. But even in hiding, Lee rebuilt the transmitter piece by piece. In a cellar outside Haarlem, she broadcast again. "The Swan flies still," she whispered. Her voice returned to the airwaves. This time, fainter but stronger. It crossed enemy lines. In London, soldiers huddled around receivers. In cellars across Amsterdam, families smiled through tears. The Swan had survived. Winter came. The hunger winter. Food vanished. People froze in the streets. Lee's broadcasts became lifelines, telling where soup kitchens would open, where German patrols had moved. Her voice was warmth in the cold. But in January 1945, a betrayal. Mr. DeWitt had been captured, tortured. He gave up the signal's location. The Nazis stormed the cellar. Bram was shot. Lee was taken. The transmitter was smashed to pieces. In prison, she was beaten but never spoke. The commander demanded to know who helped her. Lee only said, "Amsterdam helped me." Her silence was louder than her voice had ever been. 3 months later, the war was over. Lee was discovered barely alive in a Gestapo prison cell. She was 18 years old, weak, covered in scars, but she was still breathing. The city she used to speak to was no longer under control. Years went by. Lee never went back to radio, but every April 4th, on the old Resistance channel, a single sound would play. The call of a swan, then silence. It was her way of saying goodbye. In 1960, a plaque was put up on the wall of the old bakery here. A girl with a stolen voice helped free a city. She spoke so others could live. Tourists often missed it, but survivors didn't. To them, the Swan wasn't just a story. She was the reason they still had kids, laughter, and stories. She was the reason hope had a sound. Even today, with the airwaves full of music and noise, sometimes just before dawn, if you listen closely, you might still hear her hidden between the signals. She's the shadow behind the radio. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that move the soul. Hey guys, what happens when a nation raised to never surrender is forced to kneel before the world? Behind the smiles of the kamikaze pilots and the cries of "For the Emperor," Japan hid the greatest secret. They knew this war was unwinnable. In early 1944, Japan still seemed to have control over the radio and newspapers, but the truth was different. The empire had stretched too far, supplies were running low, and Allied ships were cutting off Japan's supply lines in the Pacific. Japanese troops were holding on to distant islands without any support, while at home, people started eating whatever was left, even tree bark and roots, just to survive. The American strategy called island hopping systematically destroyed Japan's defenses. Instead of attacking all areas, the Allies chose to take control of key islands, cutting off communication and leaving Japanese troops isolated and starving. Every island they captured brought them closer to Japan, and every victory made Tokyo lose more hope, even though propaganda still talked about success. At home, industries were being used to the maximum. Steel became scarce, so people handed over household items to be melted down into weapons, but these weapons often never reached the battlefield, sinking under attacks from Allied submarines. Factory workers, including women and children, worked until they were exhausted. Meanwhile, the government kept telling the people that their sacrifices were leading to victory. Schools were transformed into military training grounds. Children learned to pierce straw sacks with bamboo poles, shouting, "For the Emperor." Teachers taught them that surrender was a disgrace worse than death. At night, they went to bed empty-bellied. Many believed that when the enemy came, they would become little soldiers defending their homeland, even with barely any weapons. The concept of Gyokusei shattered like a jewel became official doctrine. The government instilled the belief that dying for one's country was the pinnacle of Japanese honor. Propaganda posters and films portrayed death on the battlefield as beautiful and noble. But behind the scenes, military leaders knew that this doctrine was merely a way to mask the reality. Japan was increasingly incapable of winning the war. A major tragedy occurred on Saipan in mid-1944. Thousands of civilians chose suicide rather than surrender, as propaganda portrayed the Allies as monsters who would torment them. Similar scenes unfolded in Okinawa in 1945. Families jumped from high cliffs into the sea. Japanese soldiers hailed them as heroes, but for those who survived, the scene left a lasting trauma. Meanwhile, kamikaze tactics were introduced as the ultimate weapon. Teenagers were trained to become suicide pilots, convinced that their bodies were Japan's last bullets. They wrote farewell letters to their families, often with smiles to appear resilient, but beneath the bravado, many were afraid and didn't understand why they had to die for a war that was increasingly becoming uncontrollable. March 1945 brought Tokyo's worst disaster. Allied firebombing raids destroyed nearly half the city in a single night. More than 100,000 people died, mostly women and children. Rivers were littered with corpses of those trying to escape the flames. The city that had once been a symbol of Japan's glory was now reduced to a sea of embers, and the government still insisted that Japan would not surrender. Despite the increasing devastation, military leaders insisted on continuing the war. Some planned a final operation, sacrificing the entire population in a major battle on Japanese soil. They believed that massive casualties would force the Allies to offer more favorable peace terms. But in reality, the plan only prolonged the suffering of a nation already nearing complete collapse. Meanwhile, the people sank deeper into despair. Famine ravaged villages and cities. Rice, Japan's staple food, became scarce. People foraged for seaweed, wild potatoes, and even sawdust. However, propaganda continued to play on the radio, blaring patriotic songs to convince the people that their sacrifice would bring victory, even though the reality suggested otherwise. On August 6, 1945, the world witnessed a form of warfare unlike any before it. An atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. In an instant, the city was obliterated, along with approximately 140,000 lives. Those who survived suffered horrific burns and radiation sickness. Japan, which had always believed in the samurai spirit, now faced a technological force capable of wiping out a city with a single blast. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered a similar fate. Although this bomb was smaller, the valley in which the city stood made the blast wave even more deadly. Tens of thousands of people died. These two attacks destroyed not only two cities, but also the last remaining belief that Japan could continue the war. Fear and confusion spread, even among military leaders who had previously insisted on fighting. At the same time, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, the pride of the Imperial Army, was destroyed in a matter of days. The Soviet attack stunned the Japanese, who had hoped they could broker a peace with the Allies. Now, Japan was completely trapped, battered from the air, sea, and land, with no allies left to rely on. The crisis at the center of power deepened. Japan's Supreme War Council was divided. Some still wanted to fight to the end, believing that a major battle on Japanese soil would restore their honor. But others, including some of the emperor's advisors, realized that continuing the war would only destroy the entire nation. Fierce debates ensued behind closed doors. August 15, 1945, was a day that changed everything. For the first time in history, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation via radio. His voice was calm but filled with sorrow. He declared that Japan must bear the unbearable and accept defeat. For many Japanese, hearing the emperor speak was a profound shock. and accepting defeat felt like losing the nation's soul. For the soldiers on the front lines, the emperor's order brought confusion. Some wept with relief, while others chose suicide, unable to accept the reality. For years they had been taught that dying for the emperor was the pinnacle of honor. Now they were ordered to live with defeat, something they had never imagined. Allied forces occupied Japan under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur. The political system was overhauled, the military was abolished, a new constitution was written, and civil rights were introduced. Japan was forced to abandon expansionist ambitions and focus on building a peaceful society. But this process was not easy. Many felt a loss of identity, while others saw it as an opportunity to start anew. The Japanese concept of honor also changed. While the samurai spirit had once meant dying for the country, it now meant living to improve it. Industry was directed towards civil development, education was expanded, and technology became a pillar of the future. In a short time, Japan began to demonstrate extraordinary determination to rise from the ashes of destruction. Flattened cities were rebuilt. From the ruins of Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, modern buildings emerged. The people worked hard, adhering to the principle that wartime suffering should be a lesson, not a reason for revenge. Within a single generation, Japan transformed into one of the world's greatest economic powers. The footsteps of the last samurai were not swords drawn on the battlefield, but the determination to survive and rebuild. From utter devastation, Japan discovered a new meaning of strength, not the ability to destroy, but the ability to stand again. In the nation's history, true honor lies not in death, but in the courage to live. Got a favorite part? Comment below and let's talk about it. In the pitch-black sky, the sound of engines approached like a whisper of death, but no one knew where the attack would come from. In 1940, Britain was by itself fighting against Hitler's powerful army. As the day ended, a new kind of fear came. The Luftwaffe's bombers flew silently through the sky at night, trying to turn London and its people into burning ruins. The Battle of Britain started during the day, with Spitfires and Hurricanes fighting German Messerschmitts in the sky. But at night, everything changed. The enemy became hard to see, and fear spread quickly through the dark. German planes like the Heinkel and Dornier took off from France, which was under German control. Their engines made a quiet sound against the dark sky. The pilots used maps lit by red lights to aim at Britain's factories and cities. On the ground, British people turned off their lights. Cities became dark, hiding from the enemy. The only sign that danger was near was the distant sound of engines coming closer. Sirens screamed loudly, like wolves howling in the dark. RAF pilots called it searching for ghosts. Radar was a new and uncertain tool. They climbed into the dark sky without seeing much, trying to find the bombers they often didn't spot until it was too late. Some used cat's eye tricks, eating carrots to sharpen their vision, a myth they clung to. Others simply relied on instinct, banking hard when tracer fire lit up the heavens like lightning. Meanwhile, civilians huddled in shelters. In London's underground stations, families slept shoulder to shoulder. The ground trembled as bombs fell, each explosion a reminder that the night might be their last. Above them, firestorms erupted. When a bomber was hit, it became a falling comet, its fiery remains streaking across the sky. For a moment, it was beautiful, then it crashed, killing crew and civilians alike. German pilots feared these missions too. Anti-aircraft guns clawed at them from the ground. Many would never return to France, their planes swallowed by the English Channel or shattered on British fields. As weeks dragged on, both sides adapted. Britain developed better radar and searchlights, guiding night fighters toward their prey. The Luftwaffe answered with faster bombers and deadlier payloads. Coventry burned in November, incendiaries rained down, igniting factories, homes, even churches. The smell of smoke and melted steel choked the survivors who dug through rubble for loved ones. Yet, Britain would not break. Churchill's voice crackled on the radio, declaring this was their finest hour. A promise that the spirit of the island was stronger than the bombs raining down. RAF pilots became legends. Men like John Cat's Eyes Cunningham, who could stalk bombers through darkness, turning fear into precision, became symbols of defiance for a nation on edge. By winter, the ghostly duels had evolved into a deadly rhythm. Pilots chased radar blips. Bombers released flares to confuse them. Above, it was chess in the dark, each move fatal if miscalculated. For everyday people, life turned into a test of survival. Kids were sent away to the country to stay safe. Those who stayed behind had to learn to recognize the sounds of war. the high-pitched scream of a Stuka plane diving down, or the heavy crash of an explosion nearby. In Germany, the government told people that Britain would fall, but the pilots of the Luftwaffe knew the truth. Each night was getting more expensive, more planes were being lost, and Britain's defenses were getting better. In January 1941, one of the worst nights happened. Over 100 bombers attacked London, but fighter planes with radar found them and shot them down. The Luftwaffe lost almost a third of their planes in one night. Slowly, the situation started to change. The pilots who had been attacking now found themselves being attacked. New ideas from the RAF, like better radar and new ways to catch enemy planes, started to take control of the skies. This made the Luftwaffe rethink how they fought. By May, Hitler decided to focus on the Soviet Union instead, and Britain had survived the attack, damaged but still standing. Its people had been tested by war, but they had not given up. They still had the skies to protect. The Battle of Britain was over, but its memories stayed with people. The skies still had ghosts of pilots who didn't come back, and the civilians who stood under the bombs, showing that even in the darkest times, courage can still shine. If you believe in stories that matter, subscribe and share this with someone who cares. They thought they would conquer Russia in weeks. Instead, the snow turned into a silent executioner swallowing Hitler's army whole. On June 22, 1941, at the break of dawn, 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border, codenamed Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest invasion in history. Hitler promised his generals that the Soviet Union would collapse in a matter of months. With blitzkrieg tactics that had crushed France, they believed this campaign would be just as swift. No one imagined how wrong they were. At first it seemed unstoppable. German tanks thundered through Belarus, crushing Soviet defenses. Luftwaffe planes ruled the skies, reducing entire cities to rubble. Columns of Soviet prisoners marched west, starved and broken. In Berlin, the mood was euphoric. Newspapers declared that Moscow would fall before autumn. The Reich believed it was witnessing its greatest triumph, but victory came at a price. The Soviet Union was not France. Every mile the Germans advanced, their supply lines stretched thinner, mud swallowed their trucks, and fuel ran low. Ammunition that should have supported blitzkrieg attacks now arrived days late. Yet Hitler demanded more. Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Ukraine's breadbasket in the south, everything, all at once. In Moscow, Stalin refused to run. Panic had gripped the city when German tanks reached Smolensk, but the Soviet leader stayed. Factories were dismantled overnight, their machines loaded onto trains heading deep into the Urals. Workers labored in freezing sheds to rebuild. Soviet industry far from German bombs. Even as cities burned, the Soviet war machine was rising again in the east. The Red Army fought with desperation. Retreating soldiers burned crops and slaughtered livestock to starve the invaders. Villages vanished in flames, leaving nothing for the Germans to loot. Guerrilla fighters ambushed convoys, vanishing into forests that seemed endless. The deeper the Germans went, the more resistance they faced, not just from soldiers, but from the land itself. By October, the Wehrmacht reached the outskirts of Moscow. Exhausted soldiers believed one last push would end the campaign. But the city was fortified, and Soviet morale was hardening. Then came the first snowflakes, delicate at first, almost beautiful. Few realized, those flakes marked the beginning of a nightmare. Winter was arriving early, and it would show no mercy. The temperature plunged to -40 degrees Celsius. Engines froze solid. Rifles jammed after a single shot. German soldiers wrapped themselves in curtains. Tablecloths and straw scavenged from barns. They had invaded the largest country on earth without winter clothing because Hitler had promised the war would be over by Christmas. Now, even standing still could kill a man. Food vanished. Supply lines collapsed under the snow, leaving frontline troops to starve. Horses vital for pulling artillery froze where they stood. Men gnawed on frozen bread so hard it cracked their teeth. The blitzkrieg that once seemed unstoppable had ground to a frozen crawl, yet orders from Berlin were clear. Keep advancing, no matter the cost. Then the Siberians arrived. Elite Soviet troops, battle-hardened and perfectly equipped for winter warfare, swept into Moscow's defense lines. Their white camouflage made them ghosts in the snow. German soldiers, blind in their grey uniforms, were easy targets. What had once been an unstoppable advance turned into a desperate struggle just to survive each day. In December, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. Soviet tanks designed to operate in extreme cold crushed through snowdrifts where German vehicles sat frozen. German units, already starving, now faced relentless attacks from men who seemed to thrive in the very conditions that were killing them. Hitler had promised victory. Instead, his army was in full retreat. The retreat was hell. Trucks were abandoned as their fuel turned to ice. Soldiers marched for hours in snow up to their knees, their boots falling apart. Frostbite blackened their fingers and toes. Some men froze to death in their sleep, their bodies stiff by morning. Others burned villages just to warm their hands for a fleeting moment. Soviet snipers hunted the retreating army with ruthless precision. Perched in trees or hidden under snow, they struck without warning. Germans spoke of ghosts who could kill a man with a single shot and vanish. Every forest, every ruin became a trap, turning the vast Russian landscape into a living nightmare. Disease spread through the ranks. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia ravaged weakened bodies. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Wounded soldiers often froze before they could even be carried to aid stations. What was once Hitler's proud army now looked like a horde of broken men, their faces hollow, their eyes empty. Despite the suffering, Hitler forbade retreat. No step back, he ordered, condemning entire divisions to die where they stood. Encircled German units fought until they were annihilated. Survivors called it madness. They weren't fighting to win anymore. They were simply fighting not to vanish under the snow. Letters home revealed the truth. "We fear not the Russians," one soldier wrote. "We fear the cold." Another begged for winter coats, gloves, anything that could keep him alive. Families in Germany read these words in disbelief. Realizing that the war Hitler had promised would be quick was turning into a frozen nightmare. By the end of 1941, Operation Barbarossa had failed. Over 1 million German soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility had shattered. What was meant to be a lightning war had turned into a war of attrition one Germany was ill-prepared to fight. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was far from beaten. New factories in the Urals produced tanks and aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them. Millions of fresh recruits were mobilizing. The Red Army, once seen as weak and disorganized, was transforming into a force capable of taking the fight back to Berlin. For Hitler, the dream of conquering the East had turned to ashes. The snow had not only swallowed his army, but also his illusion of control. Yet, blinded by arrogance, he vowed to return the next summer, unaware that this defeat marked the beginning of Germany's slow and inevitable downfall. The snow became a symbol, a silent enemy that fought for the Soviets. Nature itself seemed to rise against the invaders, freezing their ambition in place. The same snow that blanketed Russia in white purity had turned into a grave for hundreds of thousands of men who thought themselves unstoppable. Operation Barbarossa wasn't just a failed invasion. It was the moment the tide of the war began to turn. From the frozen battlefields of 1941, the Red Army would rise, pushing westward, step by bloody step, until it planted its flag in the heart of Berlin 4 years later.